All right, so here we go. Now, don't worry, we're not reading this whole book. We're just going to focus on a few of the text features. And today, be a reader, but be a reader who's thinking like a writer. Remember, you are going to be an author of a nonfiction text, and you want to think about how is this book different from all the other books so that you make your book unique and styled the way you would like to have it. All right, so let's look at features that you may want to put in your book, or you may decide not to. It's up to you and the type of text that you decide to do. All right, so we start out with a contents page. He's going to divide up the information in this book so that a reader can readily find different topics of interest. And they can kind of get a preview of how this text is going to go. I'm using this text feature chart today. And so if we look down here at the table of contents, this is going to tell the readers what information to expect and where to find it. And table of contents go in order. So these numbers over here to the side are the page numbers of the different sections of the book. And so we're going to start out with an introduction, and then we're going to have this section called The City's Ready to Burn, Everything Went Wrong, and then The Dogs of Hell Were Upon the Housetops. That's an interesting way to talk about fire. A surging ocean of flame. What a big metaphor to put right there, an ocean of flame, not an ocean of water. The ghost of Chicago, meaning the fire's out and the city is like a ghost town. And then myth versus reality. So because this event was so world famous, even at the time, news of this fire traveled far and wide. A lot of it got exaggerated. And so this author talks a little bit about the stories that we hear about this fire versus what really happened. And then finally, he's going to give us a bibliography. We'll talk more about that in a minute, and sources and an index. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We did have an index in APE, but we're going to talk about that feature as well. Okay, so think about your book that you write. Is it going to have a table of contents? Is that a feature that appeals to you? It definitely helps us navigate through the book. The other day I mentioned that some text features are visual and some text features help us navigate. So this is definitely one of those navigators, helps us get to the right information in the right place. All right, we're going to skip ahead to page 18. Okay. On this page, we have a picture here. Remember, I talked a little bit about on the introduction day about how because of this happening, cameras had been invented and they were being used, but they're not as widespread common as they are now. And they definitely worked in a much different way. And so newspapers at the time would still use illustrators to capture events versus having events captured in photographic means. So this illustration has the caption, "This is the Chamber of Commerce building before the fire. It was one of the many buildings the citizens of Chicago pointed to with pride. Many of those fancy details, such as those above the clock, were really carved out of wood. In addition, the mansard roof was made out of tar and wood." And so, this illustration with this caption gives the reader a lot more information about the types of buildings and what they were made of. Remember, this is about a fire. And so a lot of these buildings, they were kind of made to look like stone, but they were really made out of carved wood. And so that would give citizens kind of a false sense of security that things would not burn necessarily. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead to page 40 and 41. So you can see some photos. I'm going to stop here just for a second before we get there. See that little dotted spot? So that's where the fire started on Saturday night. And then it kind of lays out these numbers in this grid. And I want to, when we get to page 40 and 41, I want you to notice these little dots right here. This was like a multi-night fire. Kind of go back. Okay. So now you see the little dots where it started on Saturday night. Now here is the house where Mrs. O'Leary lived. I don't know if you've ever heard about Mrs. O'Leary. Apparently the myth part of the story, since I've read this book now, is that the cow kicked over a lantern in the barn and started this fire that destroyed a whole city. Now there's a little bit of a question mark about whether or not it was really the cow's fault or not. So this is, at this point, this is the gray area where the fire is starting to spread. So it started here and it's kind of going in this triangle shape. And then it goes on, like the numbers they correspond to the text. And so it kind of gives you a map that as you've been reading the text, you kind of understand, oh, okay, this is where that is, and this is how far apart all these other places were. And so when you're reading about the courthouse, now you can kind of pick it out on the map. You can kind of see this is the area, this is Lake Michigan, so this is how far they were from the water. Here's the railroad station. You can see all the railroad lines, and it talks a lot about how the people had to move throughout the city once the fire started burning really fast. Okay, so that, think about your story. Do you think any of the topics that you would write about might include a map? Do you find that engaging? Like I was really interested in, especially when that little gray triangle starts to get bigger and it shows how it's spread and where all the places were in relationship to each other. I found that really engaging for this book. We also had the map in the ape book. And it was kind of interesting to see how the apes lived in such small land spaces, and they were kind of concentrated on two continents, really. So think about that as a reader. Okay. I'm going to flip to the back. I'll go kind of slow so you can kind of look at some of the pictures. See how the gray area is bigger now? I thought that was really an interesting way to show how the fire spread so much. And then I like this illustration. It's almost like the map, but I mean, the fire was huge. That's why this was such a big event. All right, so now you've got all this area is on fire, all the way down to the lake. And it tells the story of people who lived in the town. And so one of the stories is about how a girl got separated from her family. Now look. So it's huge. The whole town. And this was a big town. Look at that. This was as devastating as like our hurricanes are to us now. Okay. Moving along. It really was an interesting book. It's long. I don't know if you want to borrow it. It's available on this open library. If you want to borrow it, this is a topic that really interests you. It might be a book that you might want to pick up. He put a lot of effort into this book. Okay, so how did he figure out all these stories, all this stuff that happened back in the 1800s? And how did he write it in a book that was published way more recently than that? Well, he has a bibliography and sources. So he had to read all of these books and articles. So here's one. He read letters. He read newspaper stories. And he put all of those accounts, all of those firsthand accounts into this book as a secondhand account. And then he also gives you other books about the Great Chicago Fire. So if you loved this book, if you love disaster stories, or if you have a tie to Chicago and you want to read other stories that are related to this event, you can read these other books over here. And then he also includes an index. So if you were writing a report about this, let's say you had to write something, a big event in American history. So, and you chose the Great Chicago Fire as your topic. And maybe you only wanted to write about certain parts of it, like maybe the buildings or the causes of the fire. So you would look in the index. This is arranged by alphabetically, okay? And so if you were looking for things about architecture, you would look on 18 and 19 or 137 and 138. And then maybe you're looking for other information about buildings. So you have all these, you have a heading buildings, but then you have all these little subheadings, brick and stone, collapse in the fire, fireproofing, shanties, wooden. Or maybe you're looking for some of the people. So then you would look at, here's like Bernard Gien, Benjamin Bullwinkle, Daniel Burnham. So you would look these up by last name if you're looking for some of the people that were involved in the story. And so our index goes on and on in alphabetical order. So all the things that he thinks are kind of like topics of the book, he puts them in alphabetical order. So you can just look at like certain sections. So, and then it goes all the way to the end. So that is the index. So let's say I wanted to look at stuff about Mrs. O'Leary's cow. I would just look here at the O'Learys, and I could just look at these few pages if I wanted to see information just about the cow. Like if I was writing a report, I can look just in those few pages instead of having to read the whole text. All right, so I'm going to stop the video. Hopefully you looked at some features that appealed to you, that made the text engaging and more understandable. And I'm going to close out the lesson on the last slide. See you in a second.